Welcome to Chapter 2, Beyond the Precautionary Principle. Extending on Sunstein's conclusion from Chapter 1 that the precautionary principle is a crude and sometimes perverse way of promoting desirable goals, and that if it is taken for what it's worth, it is paralyzing and therefore not helpful at all. Sunstein suggests that in order to operationalize the precautionary principle, blinders are required so that decision makers can focus only on some aspects of a regulatory system and disregard others. The precautionary principle blinders proposed by Sunstein come from 5 theories of behavioral economics and cognitive psychology. The availability heuristic, the probability neglect, loss aversion, a belief in the benevolence of nature, and system neglect. As a review, the availability heuristic occurs when an individual assesses the risk of a certain outcome according to how easily they can recall a similar situation. The issue with this heuristic is that it tends to lead individuals to focus on some hazards while at the same time ignoring others. 2 factors that impact the availability heuristic are familiarity and salience. In general, risks that are more familiar will be perceived as more important than less familiar risks. And regarding salience, the impact of seeing a hazardous event can increase the subjective probability of experiencing that hazardous event, regardless of the actual probability. The impact of the availability heuristic is that it can lead to serious errors in terms of excessive fear and the neglect of other risks. With respect to the precautionary principle, it's important that we remember that there are always 2 sides to an argument. People may assign differing values to a risk based on their individual availability heuristics. The precautionary principle encourages the focus on the risks from more familiar, salient risks, which can ultimately encourage the neglect of other risks associated with regulation. Sunstein proposes that through the availability heuristics and emotional responses to risk situations, the precautionary principle will operate through excessive public concern over an uncertain hazard. Even when probabilities are known, the risk perceptions often outweigh the actual risks. Imagery can have a powerful impact on risk assessment. When an image of a bad outcome is easily accessible, people can become very concerned about the risk. For example, the word terrorism invokes vivid images of falling buildings and televised decapitations, thereby elevating the public concern despite the relatively remote risk of either occurrence. Fear encourages precautionary measures with little regard to probability. Now let's look at loss aversion. In general terms, people tend to be risk averse. This means that a loss from an individual reference point will be perceived more undesirable than a gain of the same amount is perceived desirable. Loss aversion can impact the precautionary principle through the development of regulations that focus on avoiding loss at the expense of potential gains. From a cognitive standpoint, people fear the unfamiliar risk more than the familiar risks that they encounter frequently, even when they are statistically equivalent. Loss aversion, much like the availability heuristic, causes people to focus only on a few hazards and neglects the others. Environmental advocates often use the precautionary principle as a means to justify regulations designed to protect the environment. The belief in the benevolence of nature impacts the precautionary principle through assigning little or no risk to hazards of nature and overweighting the risks imposed by man on nature. Products believed to be naturally occurring are perceived to be less risky than a similar product that is produced by man. As we have seen so far from the availability heuristic and our propensity to be loss averse, our values impact our subjective assessment of risk, which can lead to errors in judgment about risk. For regulations that impact the environment, the use of the precautionary principle will emphasize the potential negative consequences, where any impact on nature will be perceived as a loss or negative impact, thereby leading to an excessive focus on the potential hazards and less on the potential gains. System neglect occurs when there is an assumption that if you change a social situation, there will be no effect on others. This highlights the general phenomenon known as trade-off neglect, where people fail to see the need to weight competing variables against one another. System neglect results from errors of the availability heuristic, probability neglect, and loss aversion by overweighting or focusing on some hazards and failing to consider others that may impact the system in a different way, whether good or bad. They lead people to miss the big picture. This leads to systemic errors of accepting some risks and not others, despite the fact they are equally risky or have the same potential to impact the system in a negative way. Individual emotions and interpretations get the best of them and stunt any cognitive process associated with objectively weighting the alternatives. Where the application of the precautionary principle may be justified based on proposed risks to people and the environment, the regulation of these risks has the potential to impact wealthier nations less than poorer nations. For example, where wealthier nations can afford advanced technologies to minimize risks in agriculture, poorer nations are unable to afford the technologies to meet regulations, are therefore unable to export their goods, which negatively impacts their overall economy. Such unequal applications of a regulation demonstrate errors seen through system neglect. Our biases, while well-intended, may render our viewpoints more myopic, where we fail to weigh all the competing issues relating to a proposed regulation. For example, Sunstein points out that people tend to be excessively optimistic, believing their solutions to a problem have a greater chance of a good outcome while underweighting the chance of a bad outcome. Once again, this sounds a lot like system neglect. This is not to say we need to be more pessimistic. What is being suggested is that it is important to acknowledge our biases and seek to weigh alternatives more objectively. As Sunstein also points out, there are risks and environmental values on both sides of an issue. Many times we fail to appreciate the argument on the opposite side of the issue, overweighting our views of the risks and rewards and underweighting the competing risks and rewards. The precautionary principle has inspired dialogue between science and society. Some have said that the precautionary principle encourages a democratic dialogue about potential hazards. The concern is that the availability heuristic will impact our willingness to objectively evaluate the risks relative to scientific solutions to a problem. Decision makers may, through open debate, hold to vivid examples of science gone wrong in the environment. The example used in the book is Chernobyl. Where the Chernobyl example is used to argue against nuclear power, using this example, the nuclear industry is perceived far riskier than it really is. This same issue occurs using the precautionary principle to defend individual rights. While the rights of some may be protected, the precautionary principle can lead to disregarding the rights of others on the other side of the debate. The spirit of the democratic process is open debate of the issues. To impose the precautionary principle as a guideline has the potential to overweigh some concerns while at the same time underweighting others. A question to consider relates to the arguments for the use of human embryonic stem cells to treat disease. What are both sides of the argument? What makes it so contentious? How could the use of the precautionary principle impact the regulation of this type? Moving on, does the precautionary principle serve to encourage the addition of a margin of safety into decisions that impact our health and safety? Once again, the issue with precautionary principle is that it systematically fails to equally consider both sides. Given its slant toward precaution, precautionary biases will inevitably weigh decisions heavier toward precaution, at times overweighting the risks used to justify precaution. In situations where risks are uncertain and there is a degree of ignorance about the probabilities of various outcomes, the maximum principle is used where the choice is the option that provides the best worst-case solution. To invoke the precautionary principle to guide government decision-making regarding the maximum principle has the potential to encourage excessive spending to deal with uncertain risks when resources could be used to deal with the known risks. Overall, Chapter 2 provides an overview of problems that can come from the application of the precautionary principle in decision-making. Sunstein does not support the use of precautionary principle to justify regulations. As we have read, individual decision-making is impacted by individual values that help to form our heuristics and biases relating to an issue. These heuristics and biases have the potential to lead us to overweight some risks and underweight others. Chapter 2 has emphasized that there are two sides to an issue, and the limitation of the precautionary principle is that it tends to overweight the precautionary side of the argument and fails to objectively weigh potential gains from a regulation. While precautions are important, Sunstein suggests that a more sensible approach would be to attempt to counteract various cognitive limitations in how people process risk. In order to effectively develop regulations intended to maximally protect our society and at the same time allow for opportunities to improve upon society, it is necessary to objectively evaluate the dangers we face, diminish the impact of special interest groups seeking to bias our decisions, and rationally develop regulations that maximize the overall good and minimize the dangers. I hope this has helped. That was Chapter 2. I'm looking forward to reading more into the book and seeing all of your reviews. Have a great day.